Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be covering the topic of cookies. Specifically, we're going to be going over what an actual cookie is. It's maybe a term that maybe something you're familiar with, or maybe it's a term that you've heard thrown around in the web development world. We're going to talk a little bit about HTTP and how it's known as a stateless protocol, and how cookies can change that. We're going to talk about a couple of HTTP headers. We're going to talk about the set cookie header, which is an HTTP response header, and we're going to talk about the cookie header, which is an HTTP request header. We're also going to talk about a method, a function provided built into PHP for basically what is known as setting cookies. We're going to talk about different attributes that cookies can have. We're going to talk about how to, after we learn about what cookies are, we're going to talk about how to access cookie data within your file using the cookie. There's a cookie superglobal variable. And then we're going to talk about security implications as they relate to cookies, or briefly talk about security implications related to cookies. So what exactly is a cookie? Well, basically it's a piece of information, it's a piece of data that's set by an HTTP server, and it gets sent back to a web client within an HTTP response for storage by the client. So for example, and it's done in name value pairs. So for example, a server might want to set a cookie that says user ID equals 1001. Well, it'll create that cookie, and then what it'll do is, using an HTTP response header, it'll send that cookie back to the client, and the client's going to store that on its local machine. Cookies are associated with a particular website, and basically what happens is every time a client goes to request a page from a particular website, it checks to see if it has a cookie stored that's associated with that website. If it does, it goes ahead and in its HTTP request, it sends the information contained in that cookie to the web server. So before we go into the details about how the cookies actually work, I just want to talk quickly about HTTP and how it's what's known as a stateless protocol. Basically what that means is that for each HTTP request and response, no state is preserved, which means there's no memory between one request and another. So for example, when you go to a website and you request a page, for example, let's say this was your HTTP request, and then your server would respond with something like this with the HTML as part of the body. When you do that request, let's say you do that multiple times, each time you do that, the HTTP server has no idea that that basically those are linked from the same computer. It can know that it's from the same computer, but basically it doesn't store any information about each of the different requests. So for example, let's say that you were trying to implement a shopping cart, for example, and you add an item to a cart. Well, maybe what you would do is you would send a GET request that provides some information. Maybe you have a query string that says add item 1001, and the HTTP server is going to go ahead and process that GET request. It's going to add an item to a shopping cart, and then it's going to send the response back to you that maybe shows you your shopping cart. However, when you go to the next time you go to add another item to the shopping cart, how does the server know that item 1001 is already part of your cart? HTTP in and of itself doesn't have a mechanism for that. It doesn't actually store this information anywhere, for example, on the server. Well, cookies are sort of a way to basically enable some memory, some state to occur between different HTTP transactions. So for example, cookies is to provide knowledge of previous events. So basically what it does is it connects one HTTP request from another. And this can be used for things, for example, like it can identify a particular client. Maybe when you go to a website and you log in, for example, the HTTP server, when it sends you back your welcome page, it'll send you a cookie, which is a piece of information, and it's going to say your user ID is this. Then every time you go and you visit a page on that website, you're actually going to send that cookie back to the server, and it's basically going to identify you. And then the server can say, hey, well, this is a person I've dealt with before, and maybe it can alter its page content based on that. Another thing that you can do is you could contain information in a cookie, such as the contents of a shopping cart. So, for example, let's say you send an HTTP request. You click on a button that says "Add item to a shopping cart," that sends a GET request with the item ID to the server. Well, the HTTP server can then create a cookie that says, "Okay, the cookie, maybe the cookie's name will be 1001, which is the ID of the item, and maybe its value is going to set to 1, which means you've added one of those items to your shopping cart." Well, what the server can do is create a cookie that contains this data. It can send that back in its response to the client, and then when the client goes to another page on that website, for example, it clicks on an Add to Cart button for another item on that website. Well, because as we had mentioned, anytime you go to you have cookies stored for a particular website, and you go to a page on that website, you automatically send it. Well, you're actually, when you go to add that second item to the cart, you're actually going to send this cookie back to the server. So now the server knows that you've already had one item in your cart, and it can add this new item to the cart. It can update the cookie to reflect that. But now that it knows this information about you having this item already in the cart, when it sends you a page back to view your cart, it can show both of the items because it has knowledge of that. So the way that setting and basically setting and getting cookies work is through some headers. In particular, there's an HTTP response header called setCookie, and what that does is that basically is a way for the web server to send cookie data, send a cookie, which is a name-value pair, back to the client that has information. So for an example of an HTTP response header that sends a cookie to the client is this right here. We have our typical, some typical HTTP response information, and down here you'd have the body of the response. Maybe it's the HTML to represent a shopping cart. But what you can see is it's got a new header here called setCookie, and basically what you do is you provide the name of the cookie and then the value to it. So the server is going to say, okay, I'm setting a cookie on, I'm sending to this client a cookie that actually has the name cookie, and it's going to have the value equal to cookie value. And what that's going to do is it's going to get set to the client. When the client receives this response, it's going to store this cookie for whatever website and associate it with whatever website this response came from right here. So actually, if we go and take a look at an example, I'm going to have Firebug open, and the Firebug, select the Net tab so that we can see the HTTP header information that's going on. So for example, if we click on the script HTTP setCookieHeader.php, this is a script that actually, when you go to it, it actually creates a cookie and sends it back to the client as part of the script. And we're going to talk a little bit more how to do that in a few slides, but for now, that's what's going on behind the scenes. Basically, it just shows a little bit of output of what the HTTP response when you go to this page might look like. It's going to show some of your typical HTTP response headers, and you can see also that it has a set cookie header, which basically is setting a cookie named example1 cookie, and it has the value equal to value. Now if we go down here and we actually look at our Firebug output, and we see the response header that we get back from the HTTP response header that we get back from the server when we requested this page, we can see in the raw header that there's actually this set cookie header, and it has, as we expected, the name of the cookie and the value. And so that's basically how the server sends the cookie back to the user. It says it uses this set cookie header. Now that we have another form, or another script called cookie header, which shows the client side of things. And basically what this shows is when the client requests another page from this particular website, in this case it's a local host website, what it's going to do is it's going to say, get me the page HTTP cookieheader.php. It's going to have a host method. It's going to have the host header, and then it's also going to have a new header that we're going to talk about called cookie, which is basically the way of the client sending the cookie back to the user. So for example, setCookie is used by the server to send a cookie to the client. Well, anytime a client requests a page, for example, if a client has a cookie associated with the host www.educator.com, anytime it requests a page from that website, here index.html, it's going to send the any cookie information, any cookies it has that are associated with that site back to the server. So if a cookie had previously been set and stored from educator.com on this client, the client uses what's known as a cookie header in its HTTP request, and basically what it does is it provides the name of the cookie and its value. So if we go back and look at our script here again, we can see this is what it looks like when we request a page after we've already received a cookie. So in our previous script, set cookie header, the HTTP server on our local host sent us a cookie that's called example1.value, example1 cookie, and it has the value. When we go to request another page on this same website, in this place it's called HTTP cookie header, what we can see is if we look down at the request information, what we can see is if we look at the raw HTTP request, we can see that there's a cookie header and it says example1 cookie equals value. So what it's basically done is, because we've gone to that same website, before it sends this request off to the website, our web browser goes and looks to see if it has any cookies stored for localhost, and then if it does, it goes ahead and it sends us cookies along. Well, in this case, we have a cookie called example1 cookie, and it sends the value back to the server called value. And actually, one of the things you can do in Firefox is you can actually see the different cookies that you have stored. So if you go to Firefox menu and then you go to Options, and you select the Privacy tab, there's actually a default link on the default page here. You can click Remove Individual Cookies, and basically what this does is it shows all the cookies that you have from all the different sites. So here you can see all of the different sites that we've visited to that we've received cookies from. It means that when we've gone to these websites, we've received an HTTP response from the server that had the set cookie header in it. So for example, if we search for our local host, we can see that we have one cookie. The name of the cookie is example1 cookie. Its content, or the value of the cookie, is value, which is what we had set, which the cookie is value was set. And so this shows you information about the particular cookie. So how do you actually set a cookie? Let's say you're writing a script and you want to send a cookie back to the server. For example, you want to maybe provide a user ID. You can say user ID equals 1001. So every time the user comes back to the site, it will automatically supply that information to the server via the cookie header in the HTTP request. Well, PHP provides a built-in function called setCookie. And basically what that does is that allows your script to send a cookie back to a client. One important thing to note is that because setCookie involves setting an HTTP header, in particular the setCookie header, you have to call it before any of the script's output is generated. This is, we had seen this before in examples when we use the header method. For example, to redirect a user to another web page. And when we use that before, we have to do that before we generate any output, or else we're going to get an error. So it's important that you call setCookie before you generate any output for your script. The first two parameters of the setCookie method are actually the name of the cookie and the value that you want to assign to the cookie. So if we go and take a look at a script called setCookie, we can see it's a PHP script, and before any of our output is generated, we have a PHP section up here that calls a setCookie method. And basically what it does is it's setting a cookie called example2 cookie, and we're setting the value of that cookie just equal to the string value. So when the user goes to or requests this page, basically when the PHP generates the HTTP response to send back to the client, it's going to generate a set cookie header that's going to contain this cookie. It's going to say example2 cookie equals value, and then it's going to return whatever HTML that the page contains that you're sending back to the user. In this case, it's just some output that just shows an example of the headers that you're actually receiving from the web server. So if we go and look at our example 2, and we go to setCookie.php, we can see that this is an example of what our response header looks like. So when we go to this page, we're getting a response that has the header setCookie that says example2cookie equals value. If we actually go down here in our Firebug and we look at our response and we view the raw HTTP header, response header, we can see that there is, in fact, is the setCookie header that shows that a cookie named example2cookie has been sent to the client, and it has the value. If we go ahead and we look again at our cookies for localhost, we should now be able to see that we have two cookies. We have the example1 cookie from our previous example and example2 cookie from this example. One of the features of cookies, they have several attributes that you can set, and basically these attributes determine whether or not a client is going to send a particular cookie to a web server when it's making an HTTP request for a page. We've already talked about how, or sort of implicitly said that basically when a client receives a cookie from a particular website, it stores that cookie, and then anytime it visits a page on that website, what it does is it goes ahead and it sends that cookie along with any request that it has. Well, you can explicitly set that. There's a domain attribute that you can set for a cookie that explicitly specifies the domain for which a cookie applies. So in our case, for example, it's been localhost. We weren't explicitly providing that, and what the specification does is when a browser receives a cookie that doesn't have a domain attribute set, it uses the domain of whatever website it received it from. So in our case, when we looked at those cookies in our Firefox web browser, cookies basically dialog box, and we searched for localhost, we could see that the domain associated with those cookies is localhost because that's where they came from. There's also a path attribute that you can associate with a cookie, and that basically says within a particular domain, the client is only going to send a cookie back to the browser if it requests a page within a particular path. So for example, if we look in a little more detail at the cookie we received on our example number 2, we can see information down here. We have that Firefox provides, has the name of the cookie, example2 cookie. It has its content, which is value. We can see it has the host, which is the same thing as domain, and it's set to localhost. And we didn't explicitly set that, but that's implicitly set. Additionally, if path is not explicitly set, then it gets set to whatever path. The path of the cookie is set to whatever path the to whatever path of the script that you requested was. So in this particular case, the path for our script setCookie.php was in the advanced PHP directory, or was in the example2 directory of the lecture 23 directory, of the lecture examples directory, and the advanced PHP directory. So basically, anytime we visit localhost and we access a script or request a script within this example2 directory, this example2 cookie is going to get passed on. So for example, if we refresh this page, because we're still in this example2 directory, we're also going to have a request header now that's going to pass that cookie along. So if we look at not only does the cookie get set, but also if we look at our request header, we can see that this example2 cookie has been passed along. Now that's associated with this particular path. Let's say we were to actually go up one directory out of the example2 directory, and we were just refresh the page, which is just requesting the directory listing for lecture 23. Well, the lecture 23 directory is not lecture 23 / example2, so that example2 cookie should not be our client, or our web client, our web browser should not send that in its request for this directory listing. So if we go and look down at our request headers, we can see that there actually is no cookie header that is sending that along. The other common cookie attribute that's set is called expires, and basically that's the date and time when a cookie is no longer valid. So in addition to when a client is basically requesting a web page, it checks to see if it has any cookies for that particular domain. it checks the path that it's requesting the script from. If a cookie in that domain matches that path, it will send the cookie. And then also it checks to see if the cookie is not expired. If the cookie has not expired, meaning that the date and the expiration date and time of the cookie has not yet occurred, then it will set the cookie. If the cookie has expired, it doesn't set that. So basically, these are three attributes that allow you to determine whether a client, that once you set a cookie on a client, or the server sets a cookie on the client, that'll determine when and under what conditions that client will send the cookie back to the user. Back to the server. Set cookie method can take values for all three of these attributes, both domain, path, and expires. One thing to note is that it takes, for the expires parameter, it takes a Unix timestamp. However, because in the cookie specification, the expires attribute is actually a date, a formatted date string, for example, like Thursday, September 3rd with a time. You specify a Unix timestamp, and PHP automatically converts it to the appropriate timestamp. So, for example, we have another script called cookieattributes.php. We're going to name, or we're going to create a couple variables for our set cookie method. We're going to name the cookie, example3 cookie. We're going to set its value equal to value. We're going to set the domain that the cookie is valid for equal to localhost. Even though it's done implicitly, we're just going to do it here explicitly. One thing to note is that the domain always has to be preceded by a dot. That's part of the specification. We're going to specify the path of the cookie. Again, this is something that would be implicitly done, but we're going to explicitly specify that this cookie is only valid for the example3 directory in our lecture 23 directory. We're setting the cookie's expiration equal to 0, and what that basically does, time equal to 0, and what that basically does is that means that the cookie expires whenever the browser shuts down. That's sort of a default of the cookie specification. So here we call the set cookie method. We pass it the name and the value of the cookie. We pass it when it expires, and then the path and the domain. And then this is just an output section that shows what that set cookie header looks like when we call this page, when we receive a response from this page. So if we go to example 3 and we go to cookieattributes.php, we can see here that we have basically we're receiving a response that has a set cookie header that has the name of the cookie, it has the path the cookie is valid for, and it also has the domain that it's valid for. It doesn't have an expires attribute because it has a default expires attribute, which is basically whenever the session ends, which is why it was set to 0. If we look down here at our raw HTTP response header, we can see the same information with the path, the domain, and then the cookie name and value specified. Now, one thing that you can do is let's go ahead and try to explicitly set the time. So, as mentioned, the setCookie method takes a Unix timestamp and then converts it to an appropriate date and time. So let's say we want this cookie to expire 1 hour from now. So it does things in seconds. So 60 seconds times 60 minutes will be 1 hour. We save it. Now when we go ahead and reload this page, well, first of all, let's look at the cookie details for example 3 cookie. We can see that it has the name example 3 cookie, the value. It's for the domain localhost. Its path is for the example 3 directory, and expires it says at end of session, which is basically when the browser closes, and that's sort of the default. Well, now we've explicitly set the expires value, so when we refresh this page, we're going to see that in our new set cookie header that's generated, we can actually see that now there's actually an expires attribute that's been set by the server when it sends the cookie back to the client. And basically what it does is it took that Unix timestamp that we created and went ahead and generated a date time string. And this is what the format of the date time string looks like. And basically what it's saying is, an hour from now is when this cookie expires. And if we look at the raw HTTP response header, we can see that it has this expires header down here, the path header, the path attribute and the domain attribute. Now when we go and look at the cookies from localhost, and we look at example 3 cookie, now we can actually see that this expires attribute has actually been updated to a specific date and time, which means that any time after 1:40 p.m. on September 2nd, this cookie is no longer valid, and so the browser is not going to send it anytime it requests a page on the localhost domain at the path for the example3 directory. And one thing that you can do is, in order to delete a cookie, which is to basically get rid of it, is you simply set the expires date of the cookie to a time in the past. So, for example, if instead of adding 60 minutes, we subtracted 60 minutes from the time, that's going to set the cookie's time to a time in the past. What's going to happen is, when we refresh our page, you can see that it shows an expires time that's in the past. And when we look at our raw cookie header, we can see it sets the expires attribute to a date in the past. Now, because of that, when we actually go and look at our cookies for localhost, the example3 cookie is no longer there, and that's because our browser recognized and received the cookie that the cookie was expired, so it just basically what it did was it deleted it. So if you already have a cookie, that's one thing to note, is if you already have a cookie set on your client machine for a particular domain, a particular path, and with a particular name, for example, example3 cookie, if you reset that cookie using the set cookie header, as we did here, basically it overwrites all those cookie attributes. So in this case, we're overwriting the value to value, which is the same as before. We're overwriting the path and domain. Well, actually, the path and domain will be the same, but what we're doing is we're overriding the expires attribute. So what that's going to do is basically change the value of that cookie on the server, and it's going to update the expires attribute in the past, which means that the cookie is no longer going to be set. Now, if we notice that when we refresh this page, even though we had previously set a cookie for this particular domain and this particular path, we can see if we look at the raw HTTP request, we can see that there's no cookie header because there's no cookie to pass on because the cookie had expired. So we use these cookies to pass information back and forth between the client and the server. And so the question now is, how do we access that information on a PHP script? So we have a client that we've set a cookie for. The client requests a PHP page, and we want to find out some information in the cookie. For example, maybe we want to maybe the cookie contains information about a shopping cart, and we want to access that information in our script to find out what items the user already has in their shopping cart. The way you do that is using another. We're going to introduce another super global called _cookie, and basically what that does is, on any script that is loaded, if a cookie header has been sent by the client in the HTTP request, any cookie name value pairs that have been sent are going to be created in this cookie superglobal. So, for example, if a client were to request index.php at localhost, and it were to send set the cookie header, and it's going to basically it's sending a cookie named test cookie, and it's going to set its and it's going to have its value equal to cookie value, which means that this cookie was previously set for localhost for this particular client, so it has it stored, and it's sending it back to the server when it's requesting index.php. Well, this index.php page can access this cookie, test cookie. It can access the value that it was set to using the cookie superglobal. And basically the cookie superglobal is a associative array that contains the names of all of the cookies that were passed or sent to a particular script by the client. In this case, we have one cookie, test cookie, and then the value of it is the value of this cookie. So actually, cookie val here is going to be equal to the string cookie val value. So one of the things we could have done here, instead we could have said item 1001 equals 2, and we'll say that that cookie represents that we have two item 1001 and quantity 2 in our shopping cart. So now we could say quantity item equals and what that's going to do is it's going to look for a cookie named 1001, which in this case, assuming we pass it along, is going to say 1001, and then it's going to load that value, which is going to be equal to 2, and so now we're going to know the quantity of that item in our particular cart, So if we look at our file called cookie superglobal, here we have our same setup here at the beginning where we're setting a cookie in this particular page, and then we're outputting the HTTP response that, information about the HTTP response that's generated, which basically outputs the set cookie header so that we can see what it looks like. Then also we have a section that is going to try and access the value of this cookie. And what it's going to do is it's going to output, because we're named our cookie, in this case example4 cookie, and then we're going to try to output the value of it. So what we do is if we go to example4, and we load our page cookiesuperglobal.php, we can see that a cookie was set with the value sample value. It's called example4 cookie. However, in our script, when we try to access example4 cookie, it's non-existent. Now the reason for that is that the cookie superglobal only has access to cookies that were sent as part of a request for a particular script. The first time when we requested this particular script, cookiesuperglobal.php, we had no example4 cookie. It hadn't been set yet, so we had nothing to send back to the client. So if we look at our request and response when we requested this page, you can look at the requests and you can see that there's no cookie here because we had not received a cookie yet. However, in our response, we can see that a cookie was set, example4 cookie, and it has the path and the domain for it. So now that we've received this cookie, the next time we refresh this page, we're going to send that cookie along because it's associated with that path and that domain, and then we're going to be able to access it in our script. So for example, if we refresh the page, now we have access to the value of that cookie. The reason is that because we had already received the cookie, when we re-requested the page, we send that cookie along, and if we look at the second time we requested that page, we can actually see that we've passed this cookie along via the cookie header. And one of the things that you can do is you can actually set multiple cookies for a particular page. So for example, we could set another cookie, call it cookie hello. We'll set its value equal to world, and just have it have default values for domain, path, and expires. So now we're setting two cookies when we go to this page. And then instead of just outputting our cookie example4 cookie value, let's go ahead and basically we'll just print out the entire cookie superglobal, which will provide information about both the cookies. So now what we do is when we go and we reload this page, we can see that it has access to our example4 cookie. However, we can see that the cookies array only has example4 cookie. That's because this page, when we reloaded it for the first time, it sent that cookie back to the user. So the first time we load that page, that second cookie is not available to be sent back. And actually, if we look at our HTTP header, we can see that in our cookie set cookie method, or excuse me, set cookie header, we actually have two cookies that are sent. Example4 cookie equals sample value, and then also our other cookie that we created called hello world. And when we sent this page, when we requested this page, we only had the example4 cookie. That's all that we sent back. If we go ahead and refresh this page, look at our HTTP requests, now we can see that it actually sends both cookies back. And one thing to note is that when it sends a cookie, when a client sends a cookie via a cookie header back to the web server via an HTTP request, it only sends the name and value of the cookie. It doesn't set the expires, send the expires attribute or the domain attribute or the path attribute. Whereas when the cookie is set, the server does send that information. The reason is that information is used by the client to decide whether to send the cookie back, and the server does not need to know about that. So now when we actually look at the output of the script, we can see that when we dump our cookie superglobal, we can see that it actually has two cookies in it. One is example4 cookie with value, sample value, and one is a hello cookie that has the value world. So I just want to talk real quickly about security implication of cookies. Basically, cookies can essentially be used to track users, and so they have some privacy issues associated with them. So for example, let's say you go to a website and your browser is allowed to accept cookies. They can set a cookie that, the website can set a cookie that sends some unique user ID. So every time you go back to that website, your browser is going to match the domain of that website, and it's going to send that cookie. So in that way, the website can sort of track how many times you go to the site and so forth. There are also some security issues with cookies in that they store information. So you could have some sensitive information that gets stored on a person's computer, so anybody that has access to that computer could look at that information. So for these reasons, you may have heard that users can disable cookies, which means that they don't accept cookies from web servers. Basically, the reason I'm mentioning that is it has the implication that if you're planning on using cookies to enable some functionality of your website, you have to consider the fact that some of your users may have cookies disabled, and they therefore may not be able to access any cookie dependent functionality. And so that's just something you consider. Most people typically use cookies. Most websites use them. But that is one thing to consider depending on your user base and your application as to whether or not to use cookies, because some of your users may not be able to have access to them. So for our homework challenge, basically I want you to create a script in a directory called lecture, in a directory called subdir in the lecture 23 directory, so it's a subdirectory. Basically use the setCookie function to set a cookie named user ID with the value 100. And then in the same script, I want you to use the cookie superglobal to output the value of that cookie. And remember that the first time that you browse to that page, even though you've set the cookie, you're not going to be able to see it, because when you request the page for the first time, you're receiving the cookie for the first time, so you don't have that cookie to be able to send back. When you refresh the page, you'll be able to see the output of that cookie. One thing to note is that make sure that you call your setCookie function before you try to output the value of the cookie, because setCookie affects an HTTP headers and it has to be called first, otherwise it will generate an error. Then in that same directory, create a second script that deletes the user ID cookie. And the way it does that is you're going to set the expires attribute for that cookie in the setCookie method to a time in the past. And what that's going to do is going to delete the cookie. When you run the second script, it's going to delete that cookie, and you then go ahead and reload in step 4 that first script again. You should again see that the value of the cookie is not available for output. The reason is that the second script deleted that cookie, so when you go back to that first script, you have no cookie to send to the browser. If you go ahead and refresh that page again, though, however, because that first script sets the cookie, the second time you load it again, the value of the cookie is going to be able to be output. Then, going up one directory in lecture 23, I want you to create a script that tries to output the value of the user ID cookie using our cookie superglobal. And when you try to load a script, you should notice that, again, the cookie's value is not output. In this case, it's not because the cookie doesn't exist. It's that because, as we mentioned implicitly, when you create a cookie, if you don't explicitly set a path or domain, the cookie's path and domain is the path and domain of whatever is that of whatever script set that particular cookie. So in this case, because the cookie we generated before was associated with the path lecture 23 subdir, when we're just in the lecture 23 directory, this cookie that we had set doesn't apply because the path doesn't match. So it's not going to send that cookie. Because it doesn't send that cookie, you're not going to be able to access it via the cookie superglobal, and you're not going to be able to output its value. And so that shows you a little bit about how the path attribute works for cookies. One thing to note is that practice using the Firebug add-on when you're running these scripts to take a look at the raw HTTP request and response headers. That'll basically allow you to look at the set cookie and cookie headers to basically see what's going on behind the scenes, so you can understand basically how those headers work and how the different cookie attributes, such as expires, domain, and path, are set. It also allows you to see when a cookie is set, or when a cookie is sent from a client to the server, and when a cookie is set in an HTTP response from the server to the client. And that'll just give you more practice in understanding how cookies work and when and why they are sent back and forth between a server and a client. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.